rulemaking. Welcome to this Fish Passage rulemaking webinar. My name is Thomas Christian, and I'm a third-party neutral facilitator with Triangle Associates. Along with my colleague Alex Sweetser, Triangle is helping Fish and Wildlife convene this meeting today so that they can present information regarding this Fish Passage rulemaking. This meeting is being recorded, and that recording will be posted online at WDFW's website after the meeting. The purpose today for this meeting is for DFW to share information about the rulemaking that is being undertaken to implement RCW 7757, the Fishways Flow and Screening Statutes, as well as to address rules for climate adaptive structures. And the intent is to discuss, to provide the public with the newest version of draft language and policy outlines for these rules, as well as provide a forum for DFW to seek input and answer questions. So this is an information sharing meeting, and if we can pull up the agenda slide, I'm going to make a few notes on the agenda and what to expect here in a moment, and then we'll turn it over to WDFW for the first 45 minutes or so for a presentation, and then there will be a Q&A period. So first, DFW, as part of their presentation, will cover the rulemaking process and their authorities. Then we'll speak to actions outside of their authorities, and then we'll present on the draft proposal and the recommendations under their current authority. Then about 2:45 or so, we'll shift to the Q&A period, where the public who's attending today's meeting can enter questions in the chat. And DFW will respond as they are able. And we'll take about 40 minutes for that Q&A discussion period, and then shift to next steps and wrap up right at 3:30, no later than 3:30 p.m. to get you on with your day. So just a few logistics. Again, this meeting is informational and it is being recorded. You can find the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and participants are able to write questions in the chat. Please do, as you write into the chat, be respectful and respect your colleagues who have also joined, keeping your questions or comments succinct. And please do minimize any cross chat so that we can all track the chat function throughout the meeting. DFW will get to the questions later in the meeting, but you can ask questions at any time. And then please do also note that today's meeting is hosted via a Zoom webinar, so the public attendees are muted throughout the meeting. With that, I would like to turn the floor over to Margan from WDFW to introduce the DFW team.
Thank you so much, Thomas. I appreciate that. And as Thomas said, my name is Margan Carlson. I'm the Habitat Program Director here at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And the first thing I want to do before even introducing the team is just to thank everybody for being here. I'm certain each of you has a lot of demands on your time, and we're grateful for the time here. We'll try to use it really well. I would like to turn it over first to Tom Jameson because he is off mute. Tom, why don't you go ahead and then pass it to Matt and Gabriel.
Great, thank you, Margan. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Tom Jameson. I'm the Fish Passage and Screening Division Manager. I'm also chair of the state's Fish Spur Removal Board. I'm going to turn it over now to Matt Curtis.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matt Curtis. I am the Protection Division Manager here in the Habitat Program at Department of Fish and Wildlife. We are the division responsible for interpretation and implementation of the State Hydraulic Code and our HPA program. That's our bread and butter. Good to see you all. I'll throw it back to Gabriel. Have you introduced yourself yet?
I have not. Thank you so much, Matt. Hi, everyone. My name is Gabrielle Stillwater, and I'm the Department of Fish and Wildlife Fish Passage Rules Coordinator. And so I'm the one behind the scenes helping to develop the language and shepherd this process. I'll go ahead and turn this back over to Margan and start sharing the screen again.
Excellent. Thank you as always, Gabriel, and I'll be passing it back to you quickly. Now that folks have introduced themselves, I just want to give a reminder to folks of the context of why we're here today talking about fish passage and screening rulemaking. Some of you may recall that Governor Inslee initiated an ORCA task force just a few years ago. And one of the interests of that ORCA task force is to make recommendations about the types of things that would improve the availability of orca prey. And so things that can be done to protect and restore habitat were a big focus of that particular group. One of the specific recommendations that they made is that the Department of Fish and Wildlife should create rules that describe how our fish passage and screening authority will be implemented. Although the actual authority for fish passage and screening with the Department of Fish and Wildlife has been on the books for many years, I think since the early 1900s, the Department of Fish and Wildlife has never created a rules chapter. So Gabriel's going to talk a little bit later about the structure and relationship of laws and rules. But the important point is that the ORCA task force recognized that it would be both a benefit to the public and a benefit in terms of clarity of what's required and compliance with the law to create a set of rules that describe how fish passage and screening authority is to be implemented. The governor agreed, and then subsequently the legislature agreed with that. And as a result, gave the Department of Fish and Wildlife direction through the operating budget in 2019 to begin this rulemaking. It's been a big endeavor, and I think we underestimated initially how important it was going to be and how much work it would be to create an entirely new rule chapter largely from scratch, and how important it would be to many members of the public, to our tribal partners, to our nonprofit organization partners, and the people who might eventually be regulated by this chapter to really be involved and to track it. And so we've made sure to take our time and take care with that. One of the other reasons that this rulemaking is important to us at the Department of Fish and Wildlife is that we are looking to incorporate new guidance about how to include thinking about climate change and the effects of climate change on stream widths and therefore water crossings into this rulemaking. That's a commitment that the department made to tribal co-managers in 2019 as well. And that really came from the strong basis over a number of years that we had invested in the science behind understanding how streams are likely to change in Washington as a result of a changing climate and what that might mean for designing and implementing culverts, bridges, other structures that span streams, and make sure that they'll not only accommodate the streams of today, but the way streams will be tomorrow and years to come. So those are some of our big objectives with this rulemaking and the reason that we're here today. I believe Gabriel is going to talk a little bit more about the rulemaking sort of process itself and where we're at in the timeline.
Great. Thank you so much, Morgan. And as Morgan mentioned before, we are establishing a brand new chapter for the Washington Administrative Code. And the intent of this is to make sure the WACs that we create do align with and help provide guidance for the laws or RCWs that you're all familiar with that the legislature designs and develops for us. So currently we are designing a brand new chapter. It's got a close relationship to the hydraulic code, as many people are aware of, but there are a lot of differences, and Morgan will describe that in a bit. But essentially this draft rule will apply to current and new fishways and water diversions on lakes, streams, or rivers. So for those of you who are not familiar with the rulemaking process, there are several steps that we need to do, and that's the CR 101, the CR 102, and the CR 103 process. And each of those requires something a little bit different. So we as an agency did our pre-proposal work, which is the CR 101, which was filed in July 1st of 2020. And that just announces to everyone that we are starting to undertake this rulemaking process. So once we filed that, we kicked off with a series of outreach events, starting with our tribal partners and working through various groups of stakeholders at cities and counties, our state agencies, and general public as well with that. And over that course, we were soliciting feedback, working on clarifying what our authorities were, and starting to put together a first version of the rules. So we had that early outreach and engagement. We then had an initial draft of the rules available in February 2021. And we did another round of outreach then too, sharing with the public and our other stakeholders and tribal partners the work that we have done and solicited feedback based on that. And so we took all of that feedback, and over the course of the last year, working internally and externally, have landed on the draft that we are sharing with you today, just to get more feedback to see if we're moving in a direction that, you know, befits and is clear for everybody to be a part of that too. And so what we can expect is at the end of this process, because we'll have our final outreach tomorrow, is that we're hoping to take that information and move that through to an official rule that we can move forward with. And part of the reason why we're soliciting your feedback right now too is as part of the rulemaking process, there's something called the Regulatory Fairness Act. And so we're working with a contractor right now to take care of a small business economic impact statement, as well as a cost benefit analysis. And that does take several months to complete because this is a statewide rule and it is the first time we're doing this. So we want to make sure that we are approaching this fairly and accurately, and is doing all the work that we can to get the information to make those robust as well. So we will have time to solicit comments, but now is a great time to share with us your thoughts and your feedback on this particular rule as we move forward through the process. And of course, we hope that by spring of 2023, so likely April of 2023, that we will file the CR 102 and start that process to actually get this rule to make it effective before the end of the biennium. Now, this is a brief moment for us to chat about our rulemaking authority. The big list that you see here on your screens are the statutes that we used for consideration. There are two in this list that are underneath RCW 7757 that we will not be using for consideration. One is 080, which is specific to the Toutle River and therefore didn't really apply to this rulemaking section. The other one is 020, and that section deals with DFW's responsibilities when ecology is reviewing water rights. So it's outside of the fish passage and screening focus of this rulemaking. Now I'm going to turn this over to Margin briefly to talk about the differences between the hydraulic code and the fish passage and screening rule.
Thank you, Gabriel. Hello again. Just give you a little diversity of voices too. Hopefully that helps in a long video meeting. So some of you may have looked at the first version of our rulemaking that we provided earlier in the timeline that Gabriel shared. When we first started this rulemaking, our thinking was to try to keep as much similarity and parity as possible between our existing hydraulic code rules, and that's RCW 7755. And that is for essentially our authority around construction projects and work in or near state waters. And the purpose of that is essentially to protect fish life in the face of work or construction projects. And we call that our HPA authority. That authority has included provisions about fish passage and screening for many, many years. And so again, our initial thinking was to mirror as much of that language as we could and as made sense between that existing HPA rule set and this new fish passage and screening rule set. And our initial thinking again was that keeps consistent with some of the standards that we already use and would reduce confusion. One of the things that we heard pretty loud and clear across the board was that was more confusing. And I think now in retrospect, people rightfully asked, hey, I don't get it. What is the relationship? These look exactly like the rules that you already have under your HPA rules. And so we used that as a really good opportunity to step back. We heard the message loud and clear. And as we thought more carefully about it, we realized a couple things. One is that any place where we would want fish passage to take place and a structure to be installed, or where we might want to require someone to make a fish passage improvement, our HPA authority would also apply. So rather than reiterate or copy all of the construction design and construction implementation provisions in both places, instead what we can do is talk really more about fish passage outcomes and big picture standards in this new fish passage and screening rulemaking, because anytime we want to ask someone to take action on fish passage, they will also have to get an HPA to do construction work in or near state waters. So what you will see, or what you have seen if you've looked at our more recent draft, is that the fish passage and screening rule language around fish passage, this chapter that we heard talking about, is much more simple and just talks about the standards. It's a little bit different for fish screening. So our HPA authority does not apply in wholly artificial waters. So that means, irrigation infrastructure, or the wholly artificial infrastructure that we construct when someone wants to have a screening device far off of the main channel, the natural channel of a river or stream. And so if you look at the rules we've shared with you now, what you'll see is that those fish screening rules are much more detailed. And that's because we need those to stand alone, and we need them to include design and construction provisions, because there may be places, there are certainly going to be places where we want to be able to give direction coming from our authority around fish screening, and our HPA authority won't apply, and it won't be able to come in at the end as a construction permitting authority. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Please do ask questions when we get to the dialogue and the question and answer at the end, but we just wanted to cover that and help explain or help you think ahead when you do look at the rules to the differences that hopefully you'll see.
Great. Thank you so much for that explanation, Morgan. It's greatly appreciated. And so just to cover down on, double down on what Morgan has already said, the focus of this chapter is really about ensuring that we're providing adequate protection and passage for fish. And so you'll see the main takeaway from that is about being in compliance. And in order to tell people how to be in compliant, we need to be really clear about what those standards are, as well as Morgan mentioned. But before we get into the rule language outline and dive into a little bit more about what you can expect to see for the policy that we've developed, I'm going to turn it over to Matt Curtis to talk a little bit about what's not going to be in the rule and why that is.
Good afternoon again, everybody. So I put this slide up here talking about the prioritization and funding and the complex network that is fish passage corrections. In part because some of you, many of you may already know that we've been asked by the legislature to prioritize corrections for the statewide. And that many of you recognize that we have funding for doing a lot of that comes through the programs that we both lead and work with, things like the Fish Barrier Removal Board or the Family Forest and Fish Passage Program headed up by DNR. Those types of prioritization schemes and funding are outside of the 7757 rulemaking effort. What is sort of within the scope of 7757 where prioritization and funding are concerned, is that what we're hoping to do is capture in rule features that we would use to match our compliance resources, which have a limit, to the biggest benefit to fish first. Another way of saying that is talking about higher risk sites versus lower risk sites. And though we don't have our prioritization scheme fully fleshed out yet, we want to hold ourselves to a scientifically based prioritization thinking when we think about that. And let me give you an example, because I feel like I'm stumbling a little bit. So if we have two barriers that are both going to use up DFW resources, and one is, say, the last barrier in a watershed with lots of high quality habitat upstream that is seeing use by a variety of salmonid species, versus one that is part of a vast network of barriers in a system and maybe doesn't see as much use by as many different species, or the habitat is quite impacted. We have a choice to make about where to put our compliance resources in regards to gaining compliance for 7757. And I think that's some of the thinking that we will have around how we implement this rulemaking effort. One of the things that you all may be helpful to us in this effort is if you have experience or thoughts about considerations that you have made in those. Those are perfectly good questions or comments to ask us about and thinking about when we get to that conversation piece later today. I think that covers just about everything. Morgan, Gabrielle, let me know if I missed any marks, but that's sort of what I wanted to say on this issue.
No, that's perfect, Matt. And I would just add, in addition to us looking for thoughts from you all about thinking about differentiating high-risk sites from low-risk sites for the purposes of allocating resources and doing follow-up. Please also, if you want to ask questions to clarify anything on these prioritization and funding topics, we can get to that in the dialogue as well.
Great, thank you guys for that. So now I'm going to move along to talk about the proposed rule. For those of you who had not had an opportunity to read the draft language prior to this meeting, we are going to be covering this in a bit of detail, so I won't go too far into this slide right now. Just know that this kind of covers an outline of what you can expect to see that mirrors what you'll see for the draft on there. Again, for those of you who have not read the draft, it is available on the department's Fish Passage rulemaking website, and we'll have a link for that at the end of this meeting available to you. So first, I'm going to start at the beginning. I'll tell you a little bit about the introduction and what you can expect for the instructions, definitions, and the applicability on this. So the introduction essentially just clarifies that this is the department's authority and clarifies that for that. Also, you'll see a nod to, of course, as Morgan mentioned earlier, the Orca and Steelhead, or the Orca Task Force, where they talk about the importance of restoring salmon and steelhead populations as well. But as part of this rule, we realized it's important that there are more than just salmon and steelhead in our rivers, and it's important to provide protection and passage for all fish species at all life stages. So that's a theme that you'll see throughout this rule. Additionally, under the instructions, as we want to be very clear that these are meant to be used in tandem with our hydraulic code rules, that we have a close relationship with that and we recognize that. We also want to make sure that we're defining our best passability and protection standards for new and existing fishways and water diversions, and making sure through this process that we are reflecting the language that we want to make available the current and best science, technology, and construction practices related to fish protection, and that we will incorporate new science and technology as it becomes available to provide equal or greater protection for fish life and fish passability. We will be developing guidance to help people with their fishways and water diversions, and we'll make that available on our website as well, and make sure that we're being clear about this through the process. When you get to the definition section, a lot of those are going to be very familiar to what you see and know in our Hydraulic Code Authority. However, there are going to be two new definitions for you that I want to draw attention to. The first is going to be these climate adapted water crossings, which essentially means a water crossing structure for which the design has been modified to accommodate changes in the stream flow and or channel shape caused by future climate change. And this next one is for fishways. A lot of people, when they hear the term fishways, they think about our fish passage improvement structure known as a fish ladder. However, it means more than that. So fishway really truly is a comprehensive term. And so when you're hearing this used throughout the rule, please know that we're using fishway to mean both a water crossing structure and a fish passage improvement structure. So a fishway means a device or a structure that allows fish to pass freely through or around a dam, culvert, fish ladder, bridge, or other obstruction blocking the upstream or downstream fish habitat and help facilitate passability and passability there. And finally, I'll tell you a little bit about the applicability standards that we have here as well. So we've kind of divided out into our performance standards and also what the projects we consider underneath this. So we want to make sure that we're protecting all fish species at all life stages and ensuring that they can move freely through and around fishways, and making sure that all fish species at all life stages are safe from water diversions that may cause harm or entrainment. And so the projects that this is going to be referring to are all fishways and water diversions connecting to a lake, stream, or river, as well as the repair or replacement of existing non-compliant fishways or water diversions connected to a lake, stream, or river. There are two exceptions with this rule. These are ones that are in the RCW, so these aren't exceptions that we chose to implement, but we have to honor because they are part of the existing law. And that's going to be any type tide gates, floodgates, or associated man-made agricultural drainage facilities that were originally installed as part of an agricultural drainage system on or before May 20th, 2003, and the repair, replacement, or improvement of any of those tide gates or other structures, and also any lawful diversions from a lake, stream, or river that were installed on or prior to June 11th, 1947. Morgan, did you have anything that you wanted to add? Great.
Nope, sounds good.
Awesome. So now we're going to get into the standard sections, and we want to be really clear about that. So this whole section is comprehensively about fishways. And first, we're going to talk about underneath that fishway umbrella is water crossing structures. So we want to make sure that we're, again, applying just to fish-bearing lake, streams, or rivers. And we describe to you what a water crossing structure is. And this is where you start to see that incorporation of climate change language, and acknowledging that there is so much evidence that our hydrology is changing throughout the Pacific Northwest, and that culverts that we have can typically last anywhere from 50 to 100 years. And what may be passable today, or even 2 years ago, may not be passable in the next 10 to 30 years. So we want to be mindful of that as we're installing these processes. And so part of that is we move to what some of the fish life concerns are that we have with water crossing structures as well. We want to make sure that we're allowing fish to move freely throughout them at all expected times when flows should be there, that they will retain upstream and downstream connection, as well as making sure that they are honoring channel processes as well. Fishways that are not designed to accommodate current or future flows can block or alter these processes, and that should be shown to harm fish life. And we also want to make sure that we are being really mindful about what can be considered for the standards with this. And so underneath there, this is where you will really see the language where we start to incorporate the climate change. So in addition to being mindful of excessive slope, water velocity, surface flow, etc., you'll see that we need you to start thinking about the projections of the future 100-year peak flow and future bank full width in the design of new water crossing structures. And so to determine these changes in the 100-year peak flow and future bank full widths, we reference the department's climate culverts and climate change web application on the department website, but we also have left another method that could be approved by the department if another tool comes along that meets those same requirements as well. An important consideration in this is, so when you're looking at the future change with this project, if it is greater than 5%, then you must consider that future bank full width and future peak flow in your design process. If it's less than 5%, then you don't need to consider future climate change. Additionally, we also codify our reference to the department's water crossing design guidelines and other published manuals that can help you with this, and those will be available on our websites as well. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about fish passage improvement structures. Now, these tend not to be the preference for fish passage, and we acknowledge that. However, they do have a place on the landscape to help facilitate passage through sometimes in impassable structures such as dams. So we talk a little bit about the fish life concerns, basically about how there's barriers that can block upstream and spawning and rearing habitat. And so the preferred method of providing fish passage is to remove artificial fish passage barriers and ensure unimpeded passage through fish life at all stages, as well as to maintain natural channels, processes, and functions. However, when it's not feasible to remove an artificial barrier, a fish passage improvement structure may be an alternative mitigation measure. So fish passage improvement structures are generally not preferred because they can be partial barriers to fish passage and generally require maintenance to provide fish passage as intended. And however, it also can limit to specifically 1 or 2 species and not all fish species at all life stages as well. So some of the standards you can expect to see, of course, covered surface drop, flow, velocity, all the things that you would expect to see with that as well. One thing that's important here is that we want to note that fish passage improvement structures should not be used to bypass permanent natural structures, except for in extreme and unusual circumstances where the department determines that they might be necessary to restore native fish species. However, that's a very limited space. Now, to move on to talk about existing fishways on the landscape. So as I mentioned earlier, this rule will apply to not only new fish passage or fishway structures, also to existing ones on the landscape. So we want to be really clear here about what some of the concerns are with that through the fish life process, but also to talk about what the important parts of the description are here is fishways that were legally installed prior to this rule are not required to consider future 100-year peak flows and bank fold widths unless they're being maintained, rehabilitated, or replaced, so long as they function as originally intended and have not exceeded their useful life and are otherwise not required to be replaced due to an existing agreement. So for those of you that have installed a new culvert just a few years ago or a new bridge, and you didn't think about climate change when you were doing that, you don't have to rip it out and replace it. We want to be really clear that those structures are grandfathered in, and we wanted to acknowledge that as a case. But once those do start becoming a barrier to fish on the landscape, then any future designs that you have will need to include those climate change as part of that as well. Some of the standards you can expect to see are very similar to what we've mentioned earlier, where there's no behavioral impediments to fish passage and movement, no excessive water slope or drop, that we're maintaining, good flow for them as well. An important part for this too is, so when you're trying to figure out whether or not a fishway is passable or not, is that you can start first with the department's fish passage and assessment guide with our level A and level B assessments. There are other ways to determine whether or not a structure is truly passable, but that's a really good starting point to look at a structure on a landscape and make sure that it is or isn't passing fish as well. So we wanted to codify the good processes that we're already doing here. Next, we'll talk a little bit about water diversions. As Morgan mentioned prior, this is very familiar and duplicates a lot of the language that you see in the hydraulic code. So we want to make sure, of course, that we are protecting fish as they move through the landscape as well, and that we also acknowledge that surface water diversions are really, really common throughout the state of Washington and are necessary in a lot of ways, but we want to be clear about the protections that they should be providing for fish as well. So some of the things that we do is that we assume that a effective screening is given when a screen has no apparent damage, such as holes, dents, or corrosion, and there's no accumulation of woody, vegetative, or other debris near the screen when the device is in use. And kind of after we set up those basic standards, then that's when you really see a lot of the parity between the hydraulic code and this as well, making sure we're being clear about that. And finally, this last model, I think, is really helpful for those people who are visual learners, for people who are kind of curious about what the differences are and those situations between the hydraulic code and this rule. We developed this model to kind of help highlight on just a very simple way what that looks like. So the hydraulic code really applies to our head structures and our fish bypass outlets. So for those of you who can see, those are kind of the areas that are highlighted in a reddish color. The head structure and the fish bypass outlet, those are where our hydraulic code authority apply. However, we have found through this process that there sometimes are lacking, that the fish screen may be set further back down the channel. And so there's not really good places where we can implement our authority over fish screens and fish bypass. So that's why our CW 7757 is important, and why we're putting this rule into place. So hopefully this graphic helps clarify that for you. So now that you guys understand a little bit more about the compliant or the standards that we've set for this, we'll get into talking about the compliance for this now. Really quickly, I just want to note that you'll see through non-compliance measures that we don't necessarily have fines or fees, and I'll talk a little bit more of that later, but I'm just highlighting that now. But first and foremost, the department will offer technical assistance. So if we find that a structure or a water diversion is out of compliance, we'll first go to people and hopefully try to work with them first. This is very similar to the technical assistance program that we have through our hydraulic program. And so we wanted to keep some of the successful things that we already do as an agency. So that'll start with a technical assistance visit. Whether it's been accepted voluntarily or it comes up as well, we'll have an opportunity to talk to people, visit, check out the structure, and then hopefully get through some voluntary compliance steps, which lets people know that for the areas where it falls under the hydraulic code, that they'll need to apply for an HPA to start correcting that process, and we'll give them steps on how to get there. For those projects that fall outside of our hydraulic code, then we'll set up a compliance action plan or an MOU to help people understand what they'll need to do to bring that structure into compliance as well, and be very clear about what they need to achieve that and make their structure passable to help on the landscape. In the unfortunate instance where people are unwilling to do this, or for whatever reason we're unable to achieve that compliance voluntarily, then we'll start looking at ways to enforce this rule. And initially that will come with a correction request, which many of you guys may be familiar with. And so as part of that kind of follow-up visit, we let people know specifically what they need to do to come into compliance, and be very clear about what needs to happen, and actions and steps that they can take for that. However, if that's unsuccessful, there are several things that we can do, starting of course with this 30-day notice to comply. Then we can move to a couple of different actions, such as a public nuisance pursuit, get our DFW enforcement staff involved, because there are enforcement actions that we can take as well. In the most severe cases, DFW can close a water diversion or also replace a structure. And in the most extreme circumstances, we can also put a lien on somebody's property to recoup the costs that it took for us to replace those structures. You will not see fines or fees as part of this, and that's because we as an agency don't have the authority to issue fines or fees. That's not one of the compliance steps that we've had as well. And I'm going to turn this over to Morgan to clarify a little bit more.
Yeah, no, that's great. So building on what Gabriel was just saying, to be more specific, we don't have the authority to issue fines for this particular part of the statute. And that may be confusing for some of you who are more familiar with our HPA construction permit authority. We have been given that authority to issue fines or penalties for our HPA construction authority. We do not have that authority under this part of the statute. I guess the other thing I want to say is going back to something Gabriel started to talk about earlier. The department has a strong commitment to a technical assistance first approach. Our goal is getting the fixes on the ground that are best for fish life and fish habitat. So that's always our goal. And what we found over time is that providing technical assistance first and trying the voluntary means of helping someone to come into compliance with the law has been incredibly successful. Not only has that approach, let me back up, and only elevating to more serious responses or legally enforceable responses when either there's an ongoing risk to fish life and harm, or it's egregious in nature, or when our approach to voluntarily work with someone to help them come into compliance doesn't work and isn't getting the results on the ground. And not only is that approach really important to us as a department philosophically in terms of how we want to do business and in the context of good government, it's also very much the approach that the legislature recently endorsed in giving us additional tools under our construction authority. So we feel both very, very strongly about that approach to our work, and we really believe that it's what the legislature expects of us right now. The challenge for us in this particular chapter in creating these rules is that we don't have all the same tools, as Gabriel was saying, that we do have under our HPA authority. Under that authority, we have a much more kind of smooth escalation from the voluntary approaches to the increasingly serious legally enforceable responses ending with penalties. So one of the things that we've worked hard to do here is to try and create as best we can that kind of progression from voluntary approaches to the increasingly more serious approaches without having all the same tools. That's one of the reasons that something we are still working with in this particular rulemaking is, and Matt started to talk about this earlier, trying to come up with language that would show transparently the factors that WDFW considers to differentiate between a low risk situation and a high risk situation, or a low risk, low urgency in terms of the fish impact to high urgency in terms of the fish impact, because those will be some of the same kinds of considerations that we would use in looking at this set of possible responses and deciding where to go. I also want to add right up front that although WDFW has the authorities that Gabriel mentioned, including liens in particular, that's something that has been an authority the legislature gave to WDFW in the early 1900s. We have never used that authority, and I think that's for good reason. That's a serious response, and we take we do not take it lightly at all that making the fix ourselves and placing a lien against somebody's property, not only as a very serious consequence for that landowner and that member of the public, but I think may very well, depending on the situation, not be an approach that the legislature or other elected officials would expect. And so we are truly thinking about that as an authority that we have, and we need to make sure it's identified in the rulemaking, and yet it would be the kind of thing that would only be used in the most egregious of circumstances where we can demonstrate all other tools aren't working. So I think, Gabriel, that's it for compliance. Is there anything else? I'm trying to remember if there's anything else I was supposed to cover.
Nope, that's it for compliance. And so finally, we move into the draft rule language talking about the appeals process. And that was something that was missing from the first draft. So I'll talk briefly about the importance of the formal appeals, then I'll turn it over to Mark to talk about the informal appeals process. So as with any structure owner or person that gets a 30-day notice to comply or has some of these criminal penalties placed against them, they have the opportunity to come to us and request a formal appeals process. And so in this section, we've listed out the steps and ways in which people who have received that notice to comply or that criminal penalty can come to us. It is always our first preference that they can come to us and work with us one-on-one before they go down the route of doing a formal appeals process. And so we want to make sure we're honoring and putting people first through this as well. So you'll see kind of the very first bullet point talks about that the aggrieved person can come to the department and the employee responsible for that decision and kind of have a conversation with us about that. If that conversation doesn't go well, then we definitely list steps on how they can do informal appeals and what they can expect for that as well. One area that we're still exploring is informal appeals, and I'll have Morgan talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So some of you, again, may be familiar with our HPA authority and practices. The legislature has specifically directed WDFW for our HPA permits to offer and maintain an informal appeals process. The legislature has not specifically directed WDFW to do that relative to our fish passage and screening authority. So we're still weighing the pros and cons of adding informal appeals to this rulemaking, and it's certainly something that we're looking for feedback on. I think one of the pros of informal appeals is that we have found them to be a really nice, low barrier to entry option for a landowner or their consultant to bring a decision back to WDFW leadership and ask us to take a second look at that. It all happens in-house to WDFW, so really someone doesn't have to, it's not formal or complicated. So someone doesn't really have to, hire a lawyer, for example, and spend a lot of money. It's intended to be sort of an easy and inexpensive way for someone to raise their hand and say, can you please look at this decision again? I don't think it's right, and lay out their argument. And WDFW leadership at the highest levels takes a look at that. Some of the disadvantages of that approach are that it can feel like it certainly takes a lot of work by WDFW staff. So we would want to make sure if we offer that we'll have the capacity to implement that approach and provide effective customer service and run the process well. It can also feel like an added step for an individual landowner and that they may or may not find to be helpful. We also want to make sure as an agency that if we, come to, if we really think there's a difference of opinion in terms of the interpretation of the law, that we're not wasting people's time in an informal appeal. I can talk more about that perhaps in discussion if you want to ask questions, but we wanted to give you the basics in terms of informal appeals not being a requirement under this statute. In some ways, we've found really good results like that, as I said, from the HPA authority, and we generally feel like it's a nice thing for government to offer because it's an easier way to ask questions and question a decision. At the same time, it requires a certain amount of effort to run that program. And we want to make sure that we're able to adequately staff it. So please let us know if you have questions about that or you want to talk a little bit more or offer some feedback on the informal appeals option during discussion.
Great. Thank you, Morgan, for that as well. And of course, that takes us directly into the questions portion of this meeting. I'll return the meeting control back over to Thomas Christian at Triangle and Associates.
Thank you, WDFW team. So just turning now to the Q&A discussion period, just a reminder, as was mentioned, in this webinar, participants have access to the chat. And so that's the best way for you in this webinar to ask a question of the DFW team or provide comments. So the chat is at the bottom of your screen, and I do just ask as the facilitator to keep your questions relatively succinct and respectful. And I'd also want to note that, and we'll speak more about this in a little bit, that comments can also be made online or sent via email. So the DFW team will talk more about that going forward. So we have two questions that have been asked in the chat so far. Please feel free to keep asking them. We are going to go to about 3:20 for questions. So we have about 30 minutes still. So the first question is, and I'll just read it out loud for the DFW team to respond to. The question is, in reviewing the second draft, I did not see anything referencing sea level rise as a component of this rulemaking and how these rules might be needed or might need to be amended. If there is a plan to incorporate, is there a plan to incorporate this issue?
You want me to take a first crack at that, team? Thank you, Arthur. Great question. Yes, you did not see anything on sea level rise for two reasons, I think. One is that WDFW does not have the same level of research and scientific understanding about fish passage and tidally influenced situations that we do in terms of standards for fish passage in river and stream situations. The reason that you see the climate adaptation for freshwater water crossings is because we do have that strong basis, both of what the quantitative standards are for all the fish life to pass in a flowing water situation. And we've also done some of the scientific modeling and research to understand really specifically downscaled predictions for future stream and river widths. And so we're ready because of that. And because we've been working with applicants on a voluntary basis for a number of years on the water crossings piece of this to now bring those into rulemaking. So while we're not ready to bring sea level rise into this rulemaking now, WDFW is working to assemble some of the science that would enable us later to understand how we might need to incorporate sea level rise into our understanding of fish passage, or I suppose maybe even fish screening, although I think it's probably mostly fish passage. So we are working, as many others are, to do downscaled, detailed projections of specific sea level rise change in Puget Sound and the outer coast. And I think as that modeling gets better, that'll be one important ingredient. The other important ingredient we're working on is doing research, including actual field study and measurements, trying to understand what the specific quantitative requirements are for fish passage in tidally influenced areas, because it's not quite the same thing as stream. So when we have those two pieces of information and we've done a level of scientific review and working with the regulated community and others, then I think that would be the point where we're ready to bring that sea level rise information into fish passage regulatory approach. So hopefully that helps.
Anything else from the DFW team on that? Okay, thank you, Margan. The next question reads, since hydraulic code is used in tandem with fish passage rules, could fines be a possibility under HPA authority? If this is technically possible, pragmatically, is that really an option?
So I'll take that. This is something we've talked about and explored kind of in the early development of this rule. And it is a nice idea. However, it only applies to people who have an HPA application. Correct. Now, Margan looks like she's going to correct me on this. So I'll let her take over here.
No, just add to it. I want you to keep going with your discussion, Gabriel, but I just want to make sure people understand that the trigger for our HPA civil tools is when someone has an HPA and they violate that HPA. It may also be when someone undertakes hydraulic work without an HPA. So I think that would be the trigger if someone violates an HPA or they actually take action on the ground that is an unpermitted hydraulic work action, then we would be able to apply the HPA tools.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was just going to say the only way we can utilize this is, as Margan said, in those two circumstances. So it's only if people agree to start the HPA process and apply for that application and they stop the work, then there are things that we can do as an agency, but it's only in those two limited sets of circumstances.
Okay. So the next question reads, do you have a rough idea of how many fish screens, culverts, bridges, etc. would be deemed non-compliant once this RCW is put into place?
Yes, there are thousands on the landscape. And since I've been talking so much, I will let Matt Curtis have a moment to use his voice.
I don't have a much better answer, but it is, yes, the number we estimate, just probably for water crossing structures to be, somewhere in the ballpark of 20,000 or more. But it's very difficult for us to say with certainty that as far as screening is concerned, I mean, there's going to be a lot of places where screening either hasn't been evaluated for a long time or may have never been evaluated. And so the body of work involved here is quite extensive.
Anything else from the DFW team on that one?
I would just add that, I mean, it's a really important question. And I think that hopefully illustrates to everyone here, if it wasn't something that you're already thinking about, why WDFW is already and is continuing to think about how do we sequence our level of effort. It's very clear with a problem statement of a magnitude like that, that there's no way for a state agency to go to every single one of those places all at once and really do the follow through in all of that many places all at once. And so necessarily we need to be thinking about where would we go first to have the most benefit for fish first? Where would we go second? Where would we go third?
Thanks, Margan. The next question reads, will you be collaborating with wildlife biologists and opportunities to integrate wildlife connectivity at some of the fish crossings, such as at road crossings with wildlife connectivity barriers or roadkill hotspots?
I can talk about that a little bit. Thank you, Shannon. I'm so glad you're thinking about that. WDFW is working on that, but I want to be clear, WDFW has no regulatory authority to require crossings for terrestrial wildlife purposes. Both our HPA Construction Project Authority and this Fish Passage and Screening Authority is very explicitly only tied to fish life. We haven't let that stop us and interested partners. And so we do a lot of work between our habitat program and our wildlife program, working together with partners. For example, the Washington State Department of Transportation has been a big partner. There are a number of other groups looking at connectivity across Washington State, federal partners as well. And so we just had a meeting last week looking at how we can use some of the money that we have in hand right now to increase some of our efforts on wildlife connectivity and making sure we have fresh data that would allow us to take action quickly with partners in the places where wildlife crossings will make a biggest difference, not just for reducing collisions and kind of safety on roadways, but really using the places where animals are already crossing to get sort of the most bang for the limited buck that we have right now. If that's something that you're interested in, like I said, while it doesn't fit into this regulatory authority, is something we're really active on and love to make connections with WDFW staff if that's helpful and something you're willing to do.
Thanks, Margan. So a question and I think a comment from Jamie here in the chat. We'll take the question first. The question reads, the water crossing structures section on page 3 limits the section to water crossings over fish-bearing lakes, streams, and rivers. How will the fish-bearing status of waters be determined and by whom?
This is a question about 7757 determinations, right? Okay, Gabriel, I'll let you answer that first one, and then I can probably respond to the second part of Jamie's question.
Great, thank you for that. So that's going to be through a number of different factors. The agency will work to determine if the fish-bearing status is in fact fish-bearing, and so that's going to be through our technical staff and our biologists and a number of different fish layers that we utilize through GIS streams as well. So that there's a whole host of ways that we can determine fish-bearing status of the waters.
I would just add that for that number one, that comes from a close read of the RCW as well. It's very clear from the actual RCW, the law language the legislature gave us, that the authority we have to require fish passage is specifically tied to lakes, rivers, and streams where fish are expected to be. So that's the tight tie there.
And then Matt, I think you observed the number 2 was connected. Did you want to make note of that? I wasn't sure.
Yeah. So he said this limitation contradicts the requirement to maintain expected channel processes, including distribution of wood and sediment, which will be disrupted by undersized culverts and tight pen waters upstream. I definitely recognize that, have quite a bit of experience with that, but all of that experience is under 7755, our hydraulic authority, right? Which in cases where those are waters of the state, aka not human-made, solely human-made, non-altered waters of the state, right? So type N waters typically are upper reaches of streams where they have either natural fish barriers below them or don't fit the habitat requirements of fish, or we've determined there's no habitat there for fish to be or expected to be. If there is a water crossing structure, a fishway, that needs to be in those places, it still falls under a hydraulic authority under 7755 to pass all expected flows and debris. That is the minimum standard for water crossing structures, even in non-fish areas of streams. So there still is a nexus there for our regulatory authority, but not for 7757, which is only the rivers, lakes, and streams where fish are or are expected to be. And Jamie, I hope that answered your question. If not, feel free to put a follow-up there.
And I think I would just add that I think for practical purposes, what that means is because the 7757 authority is really limited to the places where fish are or would be expected to be, when we're in that place and we're determining whether something meets a fish passage requirement, we can look at the stream functions because those are under WDFW science and engineering methodology, sort of a proxy for ensuring durable fish passage over time. We could not, with this 7757 authority, go upstream to a place where we know fish are not, where we don't expect fish to be, and use this authority as the basis for requiring a different type of water crossing structure. However, like Matt was explaining, if that place is upstream of where we expect fish to be, and something done upstream can have a very clear and predictable effect downstream on fish life, that is something we can regulate through our construction project authority, our 7755 authority. So hopefully that helps, and you can see why we're having to be very careful and take a lot of time and think through carefully the interplay of these two authorities in actual implementation.
And Jamie has noted in chat, very helpful for the clarification. So thank you, DFW team. The next question in the chat reads, how might the rule affect barrier assessment work by WDFW to update information and close gaps? Is a WDFW visit to do a barrier assessment for inventory purposes somehow separate from a technical assistance visit under the rule? So two questions there.
Yeah, so I don't think that we're going to see any major changes for how our inventory crews do their barrier assessments on the landscape through 7757. Their protocols largely remain the same, and they will be conducting those analyses to determine barrier status during those inventory. What do I want to call them? Marches across the landscape, so to speak. To the second part, there is a WDFW visit to do a barrier assessment for inventory purposes somehow separate from a technical assistant visit under the rule. Yes, the folks that will be doing the technical assistance visits will be senior biologist staff from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. So, you know, our habitat biologists are perfectly capable of that. We also have our new compliance inspector folks that will probably have an involvement piece in this as well. And maybe some other senior biologist staff that will be doing those technical assistance visits. Did I hit that right, Mark and Gabriel?
Okay. Well, looking at the chat, that is all of the questions that are in the chat for the time being. So I'll just take a moment and make another advertisement. Now is the time to ask questions or make a note to the DFW team. I think we can just take a minute here and see if anybody else has any. And while we're doing that, before we wrap up, the DFW team will talk about how to provide comments on. So we'll just take a minute here and see if there's any other questions that come into the chat. And while we are waiting, I'll ask the DFW team, is there any follow-up or additional comments just based off this discussion so far you would want to add?
Well, Gabriel will talk a little bit more about how to offer comments. I would just say to folks, you know, we really welcome your thoughts, and certainly you'll see, you know, after this webinar is not the end of your opportunity to provide feedback. It would also really help us, even if you have a question, it may not be exactly about the rule, but it may be more about implementation or staffing along the lines of some of the questions that Evan was asking. That's really helpful to us as well. We're also simultaneously trying to think ahead, not just about the rule language, but making sure that we can implement that effectively. So questions and thoughts and observations from you all along those lines is still helpful.
So one more here in the chat. Might the new rule lead to changes in the hydraulic code where there's overlapping language?
Yes, we do anticipate that once this rule goes into effect that we will need to update our hydraulic code where there are connections.
And specifically, the one specific one that I think we're thinking about, Evan and all, is relative to climate adaptation. We have always understood that by beginning with the fish passage and screening rule and starting there in terms of talking about climate adapted water crossings, that will trigger and necessitate a corollary change in our hydraulic code rule language. And will look exactly, or I don't know if the rules will be, I don't know if the language, the words will be exactly the same, but probably we're looking for total parity between how we've described this requirement that essentially an applicant must show us the math for how climate change in the future is considered in the design. We'll do that same thing in the hydraulic code.
And Teresa has posted the project website, it looks like, in the chat here. Any other questions for the good of the order today? We'll just take another moment. So Tim asks, comment here. Oh, it is a question. Thank you all. To what extent will your work be related to really large obstructions on major rivers, i.e. dams?
That is a fantastic question. What I will say is that most large structures have an existing and underlying agreement, whether that's through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission or FERC, if it's an energy generating facility or was at one time an energy generating facility, or many similar large structures, like I believe the Skookumchuck Dam may be one of these, where it is not regulated by FERC, but there's an underlying set of legally enforceable agreements that go back to, for example, the 1970s, where various entities of the state, including the Department of Fish and Wildlife, signed on to those agreements. So this rulemaking will define, to the best of our ability, what WDFW understands to represent the best practice of, fish passage, and what standards represent what is passable and what is effectively screened. And where there are those other underlying agreements, either, for example, when FERC applies, most state authorities are preempted. And so we have to work through that FERC process relative to fish passage at any one of those structures, or where there's an existing legally binding agreement that the department or the state is part of. Again, we would have to work through whatever process, dispute resolution, or change as part of that underlying agreement to get change at that particular site. So I guess the bottom line is these rules are helpful because they describe our standards around fish passage and rulemaking, and there are also clearly other circumstances, and large structures are often some of those, where there's other law that takes precedence that we have to work through when we want to see change. Hopefully that helps, Commissioner.
There are two questions here related to my understanding of proposed Chehalis River Dam. So first one, what about the proposed Chehalis River Dam along that line of questioning? And there's a question about how that would be analyzed through this rule. So are you able to speak to that today?
I think many of us could. You guys are going to be sick of my voice by the end of this. So because the proposed Chehalis Dam flood retention structure that's being evaluated would be new construction, our HPA authority applies to the entirety of that potential construction effort. And so we are using our HPA authority and the types of construction, and design requirements that we've articulated there to evaluate and give feedback on. We're a little ways away from actually, as it sounds like these two folks may already know because they sound like they're already tracking it. We're a little ways away from having an actual design to look at, but we are working hard to provide clear technical assistance and clear descriptions of the design standards relative to fish passage, as well as other related effects on fish and fish habitat upstream and downstream. to the folks, the proponents of that approach. So we're trying to make sure it's all very, very clear what the department's requirements are around fish passage as well as other fish habitat protections. Hopefully that helps. I think Terry and Arthur were really asking similar questions.
Yes. Any other questions? Let me take another moment here. Appreciation for that response, Morgan, coming through the chat. So one more question here. Does this include all aquatic species?
I'll take this really briefly and just say, no, this, as much as we would like to include this, our authorities are really limited to fish species. So we're trying to integrate that to anything that could be considered fish. And I know lamprey have come up as a species of concern before too. And that's something that we do plan on addressing as DFW gets a chance to vet and get through the science and incorporate that as part of our passage and protection standards as well.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Any other questions here for the good of the order? We'll give it a moment each time I ask. You come up with one, so. Okay. Well, as Morgan noted, this isn't your last bite of the apple here. So I'm going to turn it over to the DFW team to talk about next steps and then adjourn the meeting for today. So Gabrielle.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Christian. I'm showing on a screen right now for those of you who can see some of the options and different ways that you have to comment to us. The question we've been getting frequently is when would we like comments back by, and within 30 days. So if you can get us your comments by November 25th, that would be greatly appreciated. And the reason for that is we are moving through that process of the Regulatory Fairness Act, and we would like to be able to consider those kind of changes in corporations as soon as possible with that. And there's various ways that you can get in touch with us. The first is you can submit comments online through publicinput.com. So you go to publicinput.com and then it's / X as in X-ray 7702 the # or hashtag, depending on your generational gap, 0. Or you can email us at fishpassage101@publicinput.com. Similarly, you're welcome to mail us a physical letter to the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and please address those directly to me. Again, my name is Gabrielle Stillwater, and that's P.O. Box 43200, Olympia, Washington 98504. You're also welcome to leave us a voicemail as well. And so you dial 1-855-925-2801, project code 4535. Or you can also fax this to the department as well. And the fax number for DFW is, of course, 360-902-2946. And for those of you who have more questions or want an opportunity to review what you saw today, or look at the draft language that we have, all of that information is going to be made available in the next few days. And the draft language is already made available there through our Fish Passage rulemaking website. And that's at dfw.wa.gov/species/ habitat / recovery / fish passage / rule / making for those of you who can't see and are just listening in.
Thank you, DFW team. Is there anything else you wanted to wrap up with for today?
Just reiterating our thanks for your time. I know you're all busy people with multiple demands, and we really appreciate the opportunity with you. And as Matt said in the chat, thank you for the interest. Thank you for the questions. It helps clarify our thinking and hopefully helps address things other people likely were wondering about as well. So again, thank you very much for your time, and keep it coming through one of those means that Gabrielle just covered.
Thank you. The website as well as the email address that were referenced are in the chat here, and we hope you all have a great afternoon. Talk to you soon. Bye now.